My hands went cold the moment I shook out the folded dishcloth and a slip of paper dropped onto the kitchen tile. I crouched down slowly, like the paper might bite me. The handwriting was thin and slanted, and I recognized it before I even unfolded the page. It belonged to the woman my husband had fired without warning 11 days ago. The housekeeper who had quietly cleaned our house every Tuesday and Friday for almost 3 years. The first line stopped my lungs. "Ma'am, your husband is not the man you married. Lift the rug under his office desk before he gets home tonight. I am so sorry. I should have told you to your face, but I was scared. Please be careful." That was it. No name, no signature, just those words in pencil, the paper soft from having been folded over and over. I stood in our kitchen with the dishwasher humming behind me and the November rain ticking against the bay window. And I think for a full minute I forgot how to breathe. The house, the granite countertop my husband had picked out, the framed engagement photo on the side table, the smell of the coffee I had made 20 minutes earlier. All of it suddenly felt like a stage set somebody had built around me while I wasn't paying attention. I'm 31 years old. I have been married to my husband for 4 years. I gave up my marketing job at a downtown agency 2 months after the wedding because he said he made enough for both of us, and he didn't like the hours I was keeping. I told myself I was lucky. I told myself a lot of things. I read the note a second time, then a third. Lift the rug under his office desk. My husband's office was at the back of the house, just off the mudroom, with a window that looked out onto our backyard and the cedars along the fence. He kept it locked when he wasn't home. He had told me, the first month after we moved in, that it was because of client files, confidentiality, the kind of paperwork that wasn't supposed to be left lying around. I had nodded and forgotten about it because, honestly, his work bored me, and I had no reason to go in there. Now I was standing in the hallway with my hand pressed flat against the door, and my own pulse felt like a stranger pounding from inside my chest. The door was unlocked. That was the first thing that didn't match. He had been in a hurry that morning, leaving before 7 for a client meeting in Mississauga, and he must have forgotten to turn the key. He never forgot. In 4 years, I could count on one hand the number of times that door had been left open when he wasn't inside. I pushed it. The hinge gave a small, embarrassed creak. His office looked the way it always did. A heavy oak desk against the back wall. A leather chair, the color of dark caramel. A wall of bookshelves with all the spines lined up just so. A framed print of the Toronto skyline above the credenza. And in the center of the room, under the desk and stretching out almost to the doorway, a thick wool area rug in deep navy with a pale border. It had been there since we moved in. I had been the one to choose it. I remembered ordering it from a place on Queen Street and waiting 6 weeks for delivery. I stepped onto it. The wool was soft under my socks. I knelt down, slid my fingers along the edge, and lifted the corner closest to the desk. The hardwood underneath looked like the rest of the floor. Honey-colored oak, board after board running lengthways, gleaming where the lamplight reached. I sat back on my heels, almost relieved. Maybe the note was nothing. Maybe she had been angry about being let go and was just trying to scare me. Then I noticed the board. One board, second row from the wall, had a hairline gap running along its length that the others didn't. A clean, deliberate gap. I leaned closer and pressed my thumb against the wood. It gave, just slightly. Hinged or loose, I couldn't tell yet. That was when I heard the garage door start to roll up. My whole body locked. I have never felt my heart land in my mouth the way it did in that second. He wasn't supposed to be home for hours. He had a lunch meeting and 2 afternoon calls and a 6 o'clock dinner he had been complaining about all week. I scrambled to drop the corner of the rug back into place, smoothed it flat with both hands, stood up, and pulled the office door closed behind me as fast as I could without slamming it. I made it to the kitchen island just as I heard the mudroom doors swing open and his boots come off in the tray. "Hey," he called. His voice was casual. "Forgot my binder." I tried to answer and my throat closed. I cleared it and tried again. Oh, hi. I was just making more coffee. He walked into the kitchen in his sock feet, still in his suit. He's tall and lean and good-looking in a way that I think a lot of people probably trust on site, which is part of how he makes his living. He gave me a quick smile and a kiss on the temple. He smelled like his cologne and the cold air outside. You're in early, I said. Forgot a folder for the Burlington thing. I have to run back downtown. I nodded. I held the coffee mug between both hands so he wouldn't see them shake. Want me to grab it? No, it's in the office. I'll get it. I watched him walk down the hallway. I watched him stop at the office door. I watched him notice that it wasn't locked. He turned and looked at me down the length of the hall. I have replayed that look more times than I can count. There was nothing on his face that you could have pointed at and called wrong, but something underneath the surface of it tightened, and I felt it across the distance like a draft sliding under a door. Were you in here? He asked. Just to put the throw pillow back on the chair, I said. It fell off when I was vacuuming yesterday. He held the look for one extra second. Then he stepped inside, came out 30 seconds later with a leather folder under his arm, and closed the door. I heard the deadbolt click home. He kissed me again on the way out, told me he might be late, told me to lock up after him. When the garage door rolled down behind him, I made it as far as the kitchen sink before I bent over it and threw up. That night, I lay in our bed and watched the ceiling and listened to him breathing beside me, and I could not stop seeing his face when he turned and looked at me down the hall. He had never looked at me like that in 4 years. I kept telling myself I was imagining it. I kept telling myself that the housekeeper was a woman who had been let go and was lashing out, and that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for a loose floorboard in a 100-year-old house in Oakville. Old houses have loose floorboards. That doesn't mean anything. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the note again. I was scared. She had been with us for almost 3 years. She had a daughter she was putting through college in Hamilton. She was the kind of person who would slip a handwritten card into my Christmas envelope every December. She wasn't the kind of person to write a note like that for nothing. I rolled onto my side and pretended to sleep. Morning came gray and wet. He was up before me, which was unusual. By the time I came downstairs in my robe, he was at the kitchen island with a Tim Hortons cup in one hand and his phone in the other, and the door to his office was open. He was watching me, not in an obvious way, but I could feel his eyes track me as I crossed the kitchen. You sleep all right? He asked. Not great. You were tossing. Bad dreams. He waited a beat. Then, in a voice that was a little too gentle, he said, You've seemed off lately. You should think about going back to see Dr. What was her name? The one from when your dad died. I stopped at the coffee maker with my back to him. My father had passed away the spring before our wedding. I had seen a therapist for about 4 months afterward. He had insisted on it at the time, and I had been grateful, and then I had stopped going because I was fine and because the bills were piling up and our wedding was draining everything. He had never brought her up again, not once in 4 years, until now, less than 12 hours after I almost lifted that rug. I'll think about it, I said. He kissed the back of my neck and said he had a long day and that he would try to be home for dinner. The moment his car backed out of the driveway, I went to the front window and watched him until he was gone past the cedar on the corner. Then I waited another 15 minutes, because I had read enough things in my life to know that people sometimes circle back. He didn't. I went into his office. The door was locked this time. I had expected that. I had also remembered, lying in bed at 3 in the morning, that there was a small brass key in a tea tin in the pantry that he had once shown me, half laughing, and said was the spare for everywhere in the house. He had been 3 glasses of wine in. He had probably forgotten he ever told me. I hadn't. The key fit. The door swung open. I pulled the rug back from the desk completely this time and dragged it onto the hallway runner so it was out of the way. I knelt on the bare hardwood, found the hairline gap I had seen the day before, and pressed. The board lifted on a small hinge I hadn't been able to see. Underneath, set into a cavity between the joists, was a shallow metal box about the size of a sheet of paper. The lid had a small recessed handle. I lifted it. For a second, I couldn't process what I was looking at. Photographs, stacks of them, held together with elastic bands. I picked up the top stack and slid the band off. The first photo was of me, asleep, on our bed, in a tank top I recognized from 2 summers ago. The angle was from above and slightly behind, like a camera mounted high on the wall behind the headboard. The next photo was of me in the ensuite, leaning over the sink to put in a contact in a robe that had fallen open. The next one was me in the kitchen, in a sweatshirt, eating cereal at the island. The next was me on the phone with my mother, sitting on the couch in the den, my legs tucked under me. Date stamped in the corner. 18 months ago. I went through the stack with my hands shaking so hard I could barely separate the photos from each other. There were dozens. There were hundreds. Every room of our house. Some of them were stills from video. You could tell by the slight blur in motion. Some of them were from angles that I couldn't even figure out the source of until I started counting the vents and smoke detectors on each wall in my mind. Under the photographs were 3 small black USB drives, each one labeled with a strip of masking tape and his neat block handwriting. The first said Broom Master. The second said Command. The third said Nah. Under the USB drives was a thick brown envelope. Under the envelope, taped to the bottom of the metal box, was a folded square of lined paper, and the moment I peeled it free, I recognized her handwriting again. The housekeeper's. She had hidden a second note inside the cache itself. I unfolded it. "Ma'am, I found this in October when I was cleaning behind his desk. The board came loose under my knee. I did not touch the drives. I took 2 photos with my phone of what is inside the envelope and I put it back exactly the way I found it. I was going to tell you. He came home before I could. I think he saw me look at the rug. The next day, he fired me. If you are reading this, the dishcloth idea worked. Please, ma'am, do not let him know you have seen this. Please go to the police. Take everything with you. I will help in any way I can. My number is on the back." I turned the page. Her cell number was written along the bottom edge, and underneath, in smaller letters, "My daughter's name is on my voicemail, so you know it is me." I sat back on my heels, and I think I made a sound I have never made before. Not crying. Something rougher. Lower. The kind of sound that comes out of you when your whole understanding of your life shifts a quarter turn and everything you thought was furniture is suddenly the wrong shape. I forced myself to open the envelope. Inside were documents, many of them. The first was a printout of an online life insurance policy summary in my name, for an amount I had never been told about, and a beneficiary line that read his name and only his name. The policy was 18 months old. I had never signed anything related to it. There was a copy of the application attached. The signature on the bottom looked almost like mine. Not quite. The loop on the second letter of my first name was wrong. I have been signing my name the same way since I was 14. The next document was a power of attorney for personal care, naming him as my decision-maker if I ever became incapable. Also forged. The next was a printed-out email he had drafted, but apparently not sent, addressed to my mother, talking about how worried he was that I had been spiraling again since my father's death. How I had been making accusations that didn't line up with reality. How I had stopped sleeping and was talking to people who weren't there. How he wanted her to know that whatever I might say to her in the coming weeks, he was getting me help. He was attaching the contact info for a clinic in Burlington. The next was a printout from a property listing in Muskoka. A cottage on a back lake, no neighbors within a kilometer, accessible only by a single dirt road that was unmaintained in winter. Listed as a private rental. 3 nights booked 2 weeks from now. Friday to Monday. The last sheet of paper was a checklist. Handwritten, in his writing. I had to read it twice before my brain accepted what it was saying. It wasn't long. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a list. Things to take. Things to leave. Reminders. Cancel cleaner. Move OneDrive backups off shared. Switch phone plan to mine before. And at the bottom, underlined twice, make sure she drives up alone Sunday morning. I sat there on the bare floor of my husband's office in our house in Oakville on a Wednesday morning in November, and I understood that the man I had been sleeping next to for 4 years was planning to kill me at a cottage in 2.5 weeks. I don't remember standing up. I remember being in the kitchen, sliding the envelope and the 3 USB drives and the housekeeper's note into a canvas grocery bag from under the sink. I remember walking back into the office and putting the photographs back exactly the way they had been, replacing the metal box, lowering the hinged floorboard until it sat flush, dragging the rug back over it, smoothing the wool, looking around the room twice to make sure nothing was different. I remember locking the door, returning the key to the tea tin in the pantry, and stuffing the canvas bag into the bottom of my gym duffel in the front hall closet. Then I sat on the bench in the front hall with my hands on my knees, and I made myself breathe slowly until I could see straight. The first thing I did was call her. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was careful. When I said my name, there was a long pause, and then I heard her start to cry. Very quietly, the way she always cried, with her hand probably over the receiver. I told her I had found everything. I told her I needed her to come somewhere safe with me to talk, not to the house, anywhere else she wanted. She said she could meet me at the food court in Square One in an hour. I went. She was waiting at a table by the window with a coffee she hadn't touched. She is in her 50s. Soft around the eyes, and she stood up when she saw me and held me for a long time without saying anything. I told her everything I had seen. She told me everything she knew, that she had noticed him watching her on her phone once on a small screen in his office that he hadn't realized she could see from the hallway, that he had begun acting strange with her about 6 weeks before he let her go. That he had once asked her, in a way that didn't sound like a joke, whether I ever talked to her about leaving him. She had a younger brother who was a constable with Peel Regional. She had already, 2 weeks ago, told him in general terms that something at her old job had scared her. He had told her she needed to bring something concrete. The photographs on her phone weren't enough on their own. 2 pictures of an envelope and a USB drive sitting in a hole in a floor wasn't proof of anything. I asked her if her brother could put me in touch with someone in the right division. She nodded and pulled out her phone right there at the table. Within an hour, I had a name and a phone number for a detective in the financial crimes unit at the regional service who also worked on what she called intimate partner files. Within 2 hours, I had an appointment for the following morning at a small office above a bakery in Mississauga that the housekeeper's brother said was the kind of place where you could go in without being noticed. I went home before my husband did. I cooked. I set the table. I poured him a glass of the red he liked. I asked him about his day, and I listened to him talk about a client in Etobicoke who was trying to time the market, and I laughed in the right places, and I went to bed at the same time as him, and I let him put his arm around my waist, and I lay there in the dark and stared at the smoke detector above our bed for 2 hours because I now knew what was inside it. The next morning, I told him I was meeting a friend from my old agency for coffee. I went to the bakery instead. The detective was a woman in her 40s named Helena. She had a flat, calm way of speaking that I think was probably trained into her, and she listened to my entire story without interrupting once. When I finished, she looked at the canvas bag on the table between us and asked if I would consent to her taking custody of the contents that day. I said yes. She gave me a receipt. She told me, very gently, that an arrest on the basis of what I had brought her was not going to happen that afternoon. There were procedures. There were warrants. The forged documents alone were serious, but the rest of it, especially the cottage rental and the checklist, needed to be tied to him with enough certainty that a defense lawyer couldn't sell a jury on coincidence. She asked me whether I felt safe going home that night. I told her I didn't think I had a choice. If I disappeared from the house now, he would know. The trip wasn't for 2.5 weeks. We had time. She didn't love it, but she agreed. She also gave me the name of a criminal lawyer who could help me protect myself in the meantime, and she told me very clearly that the smartest thing I could do was act exactly the way I'd been acting for the last 4 years. No changes, no flinches, no questions. He could turn into ammunition for the email he had drafted to my mother. I went straight from the bakery to the lawyer's office, which was on the 7th floor of a building near University in Dundas. Her name was Margaret. She was in her 60s, gray-haired, no nonsense. And within the first 10 minutes of our meeting, she had me sign a notarized statement, walked me through how to revoke the forged power of attorney without alerting him, and made me write down a list of everyone I trusted to corroborate, if it came to it, that my mental state had been completely normal for the last 2 years. Then she made a phone call I didn't fully understand at the time, hung up, and told me that a licensed private investigator she worked with was going to be sitting in a parked car on my street, 2 houses down, in an unmarked vehicle for the next 2.5 weeks. He would not approach the house. He would not be visible. But if anything ever happened in there that I could not control, all I had to do was send a single text to a number she gave me, and people would be at the door within 4 minutes. I asked her how much that was going to cost. She said, "We'll deal with that after we've kept you alive." I drove home in the rain with my hands at 10 and 2, and I sang along to the radio so I wouldn't cry. For the next 2 weeks, I was the best wife I have ever been. I made the meals he liked. I wore the perfume he had bought me last Christmas. I asked him about his day with the right amount of curiosity and not too much. I laughed at the things that were supposed to be funny. I let him put his hand on the small of my back when we were standing in line at the Elsie Bow on Saturday, and I did not flinch. I let him kiss me goodnight every night, and I did not flinch then either. I went to a yoga class on Tuesday. I called my mother on Wednesday. I had coffee with one of his cousins on Thursday, and I told her I was thinking about going back to work in the new year, and she said she was so glad to hear it. I was, every single day, sending copies of everything I had to 3 different secure cloud accounts and to Margaret's office. I had quietly transferred half of our checking account into a separate account at a different bank under only my name, with the housekeeper as my emergency contact instead of him. I had opened a safety deposit box. I had given my mother in person a sealed envelope and told her not to open it unless I went missing or died. She had cried. She had asked me what was going on. I had told her she had to trust me for 2 more weeks. She had nodded and put the envelope in her freezer. On the Friday before the trip, he came home and told me he had booked us a cottage in Muskoka for the long weekend and that he wanted to do something special. Just the 2 of us. He said he knew things had been tense and that he wanted to make it right. He said he had even rented us separate vehicles so I could drive up on Sunday morning after I had a chance to sleep in, because he knew I had been tired. I told him that sounded wonderful. He pulled me close and kissed the top of my head, and I felt his arm tighten around my shoulders just slightly more than it should have, and I knew that he knew that I knew nothing, and I let him believe it. The arrest happened on Saturday morning at 6 minutes past 11. He was loading the back of his SUV with 2 duffel bags and a hard plastic case I had never seen before. I was at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee in my hands, and I watched 2 unmarked cars roll up the driveway behind him, and I watched Helena get out of the passenger side of the first one with 3 uniformed officers behind her. He turned around with the case still in his hand. I cannot describe his face for you because I will not give it the dignity of being remembered. I watched him through the window, and I watched him understand in stages what was happening. I watched him look at the house. I watched him look for me. I watched his eyes find me at the kitchen window. I watched his expression try to become 4 different things at once and fail at all of them. I lifted my coffee mug. The officers walked him to the back of the second car. Helena came up the front steps and rang the bell because she is a polite person, and I opened the door for her. She told me he was being charged. She listed the charges. There were more of them than I had expected. She told me she would need me at the station that afternoon to make a formal statement and that an advocate would be there. She told me the cottage rental in Muskoka had been canceled by the owner 2 days earlier at the request of the OPP, who had been quietly coordinating with her unit. She told me the hard plastic case in his hand had contained, among other things, a pre-loaded syringe of a substance her team had not yet identified, but had every intention of identifying by Monday. I asked her if I could sit down. She helped me to the bench in the front hall, the same bench where I had sat with my hands on my knees 2.5 weeks earlier. I called the housekeeper from that bench. She picked up on the first ring. I told her it was done. I heard her exhale on the other end of the line in a way I will hear in my head for the rest of my life. She told me her brother had already called her. She told me she was on her way over. I told her there was no rush. She said there was, and she hung up. She arrived 20 minutes later with a casserole dish in her hands and a small overnight bag over her shoulder, and she walked into my kitchen and put the dish on the stove and turned the oven on and started making coffee like she had never been gone. And I sat at the island and watched her move, and I cried for the first time in 2.5 weeks. She stayed with me that night, and the night after that. And, eventually, when I could not bear to be in that house anymore and I sold it before the new year, she helped me pack. I rent a small condo near High Park now. I went back to work at a smaller agency in March. I see a therapist on Thursdays. The criminal case is moving through the system at the speed criminal cases move, which is to say, slowly, but my lawyer tells me the evidence is the strongest she has seen in 20 years of practice. And the man I used to call my husband is currently being held without bail because the forged power of attorney triggered a separate fraud investigation that uncovered 3 other women he had been speaking to online in the 18 months before me, 2 of whom had asked him questions about insurance. The housekeeper has dinner with me every other Sunday. Her daughter graduated in the spring. We sat in the 3rd row. There are mornings when I still wake up and forget for a half second where I am, and my hand reaches across to the other side of the bed before I remember, and for that half second the old fear comes back. Then I remember the dishcloth, and the loose floorboard, and the woman who risked her livelihood to fold a piece of paper into a kitchen drawer for me to find, and I remember that I am here, and he is not, and a half second passes. I am alive. I am safe. I am awake.